When you think of the Great Barrier Reef, you will probably think of pretty fish of exotic colors, big spiny coral and reds and purples arching over big ocean chasms. This is probably what you would see on a pamphlet for a tour to the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is like a butterfly. At first it looks beautiful, but when you look closely it's actually quite creepy looking. The Barrier Reef may seem like a rainbow-colored fish paradise, but is actually a place of tricks, fear, and constant death. A barrier reef is a reef parallel to the shore with a deep section in between. The Great Barrier Reef is 2,300 kilometers wide and has over 900 islands in it. Now let's look at 3 individual parts of the reef. Part 1. Coral. Coral. What is coral? Coral, in scientific terms, means a marine invertebrate that lives in thick colonies made of polyps. Polyps themselves are small, soft-bodied invertebrates closely related to jellyfish. At their base is a limestone skeleton called a calicule. Coral starts growing with the polyps, who secrete calcium carbonate, which is a base to the polyps. Calcium carbonate soon turns to limestone, making it quite sturdy. After the polyps have grown a lot higher than the calcium carbonate, the polyps create another layer of calcium carbonate, and it repeats over and over until you have an amazing structure. Coral can grow in many ways, creating different species of coral. Depending on the way the polyps grow, different shapes will emerge. The main types of coral are branching, digitate, table, elkhorn, foliase, encrusting, massive or ball, and mushroom. These types of coral are the usual shapes that make coral. For example, brain coral is a huge coral in the shape of a brain, making it a massive or ball coral. Coral is also classified as either soft or hard coral by the number of small tentacles on a polyp. Hard coral has 6 per polyp, while soft coral has 8. Corals feed when polyps stick out their tentacles, and using nematocysts, a stinging goo found on jellyfish and sea anemones, they paralyze plankton and in some cases extremely small fish. Having paralyzed the plankton, they then proceed to pull the plankton to their mouth, where it is digested, then turned into calcium carbonate. All that is not needed, like debris stuck on the tentacles, is then expelled through the same opening. An interesting fact is that corals prefer to feed in the night and clear debris off themselves in the day. The tentacles are used to sweep off the debris, which is why corals always seem so clean and gleaming. Corals reproduce when they either divide into 2 polyps or when the polyps release sperms and eggs into the water at the same time, making polyps in the middle of the water. These polyps then float off to land on a hospitable spot to make more coral. Coral is an important part of our ecosystem, but coral has the problem of natural disasters destroying huge colonies that have been growing longer than most of the trees on Earth in a single minute, or the threat of pollution, overfishing using bad practices, climate change, and the selling of corals for aquariums, or problems like oil spills, clumsy footwork while on coral, and fishing with nets, dynamite, and cyanide. Corals are also like humans in that they can catch diseases like black or yellow band disease, white plague, and white pox. Only one of many coral diseases has ever had a cure being found. Diseases for coral work by exposing the limestone interior, making the coral weaker and weaker until it dies. We need to protect these beautiful creatures, but we will talk about that in Part 3. Part 2. Creatures of the Reef. If you think about the reef, what creature do you first think of? Probably fish. Now there are many different types of creatures in the reef besides fish, like mammals, birds, and mollusks. When you think of the ocean, the first thing you think of probably isn't birds, and also giraffes. But birds are actually quite common in the reef because they can roost on mangroves or islands created by large outcroppings of coral. There are just over 200 species of birds that live on the Great Barrier Reef, and the most common are the roseate tern and the white-breasted sea eagle. For mammals in the reef, you have your choice of whales, dolphins, and dugongs. For whales, there are dwarf mink and humpback. For dolphins, there are Irrawaddy and Indo-Pacific. And finally, for dugongs, the close relative of manatees and, believe it or not, elephants, you have this. In the Great Barrier Reef, there are also a couple of reptiles in that big ol' reef. There are 6 or 7 types of sea turtles living in the reef: green, hawksbill, leatherback, loggerhead, flatback, and olive ridley. Fun fact, the gender of a sea turtle is determined by the heat of the sand around their egg when they are born, cold for male and warm for female. There are lots of sea snakes in the reef, 14 to be exact. They evolved from normal snakes about 135 million years ago. Of all the creatures in the Great Barrier Reef, the one there is most of is the mollusks. There are 5,000 different types of mollusks. Mollusks include clams, octopuses, sea snails, cuttlefish, squid, and cone shells. Giant clams can live for 70 years and grow 1 meter long. The largest pearl ever found was sold for $1 million in New York. Besides the coral that we have already talked about, for vegetation there is 60 species of seagrass, which is different than seaweed and algae because it is rooted and flowers. Algae and seaweed are also on the reef. Seaweed can also be poisonous, but most isn't. Fun fact, seaweed is used in a lot of things besides sushi, like ice cream and printer ink. The only tree in the reef is called a mangrove. Mangroves are large trees with long roots above the ground that are as large as they are because of the tide. Now for the main part of the reef, fish. What do you think of when you think of oceans, water, lakes, and all of that stuff? Fish. Fish are one of the most interesting creatures you can find in the reef because of the variety of shapes and sizes. From the whale shark to the tiny gobbies, there are over 1,500 types of fish in the reef. There are so many types of fish in the Great Barrier Reef that I would just like to have a moment showing some of the really interesting types in the Great Barrier Reef. Part 3. Threats to the Reef. As great as the Great Barrier Reef is, humans are humans and we tend to do dumb things. These dumb things usually end up costing us dearly in something natural. Some of these dumb things affect the Great Barrier Reef, which is sad. The first thing I will talk about is fishing. What do you think of when you think of fishing? Probably this guy. Well, that is what should be done if fishing is done at all at the Great Barrier Reef. Yet there's still that dumb guy who goes to the reef, shoves a stick of dynamite in the water, and blam! A few dead fish and a hole in hundreds of years of coral. Yes, this is a problem. This is the equivalent of using a flamethrower to catch a rabbit in the middle of a highly flammable forest. Another problem that is closely related is cyanide fishing. Cyanide, as in the poison. Yes, people will be as dumb as to put poison in the water to get a pretty fish. For the next kind of fishing problem, think about this. Here's a big fishing boat pulling a large net to catch a certain kind of fish. I think you can guess what happens next. Net catches on reef, pulling the coral apart. Net brings up tons of wasted other fish they don't need. In the end, coral and fish are wasted. Now for the problem we heard so much about on Earth Day in Grade 2. Pollution. I think we have all heard quite a lot about this subject, so I will make it short. If you are ever in a tour of the Great Barrier Reef, don't dump your trash in the water. I think we all know that. Here's a problem we always hear our parents muttering about over the newspaper: oil spills. Oil spills are when a ship has the cargo of oil and spills it everywhere. I'm pretty sure we could all figure that out. The last big spill on the reef was on the 3rd of April 2010. Here's another topic your parents probably talk about: climate change. Climate change is how us humans create carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, warming our planet, making things like intense droughts and heavy rain. This affects the Great Barrier Reef by doing something called bleaching coral. Warm water levels draw away zooplankton, which holds the color in coral, making it look bleach. Then the coral becomes weak and it is impossible to combat diseases. In closing, the reef is an intricate ecosystem that we should always value as an amazing structure. From the small coral who have grown since the last ice age to the fish who have lived, made homes in, killed, and died in the coral, the Great Barrier Reef is a truly magnificent ecosystem with its own problems, inhabitants, and structure.